Hi, I'm Barry Lynn. I'm the executive director of Open Markets Institute, and I'm one of the founders of the Center for Journalism and Liberty. We launched CJL in late 2019 as part of the Knight Research Network to focus on identifying and establishing market structures that will ensure the full independence and robustness of American journalism in the digital age. I'm truly thrilled today to be able to introduce Nikki Usher, who is a senior fellow at CGL, and Nikki's new book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue: How Power and Place Distort American Journalism. Nikki is also an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the author of two previous books. I first met Nikki about 5 years ago at a holiday party in the offices of a foundation here in DC. One of those places where people speak very softly and try to avoid all references to power and class. After talking to Nikki for about 5 minutes, I realized two things. Nikki Usher is a brilliant observer of today's journalism, and Nikki Usher is a hell of a fighter. And I thought to myself, Nikki and I are going to work together someday to help save journalism in America from the powers that now most threaten it, especially Google and Facebook, but also from the prejudices and wealth of the privileged. Then power and politics got in the way. Donald Trump won the White House. Google pushed open markets out of our longtime home. Facebook decided they wanted to rule the world. So it took a while, but in late 2019, Nikki and I reconnected. And this book is proof of two things. First, that Nikki indeed has the chops to save American journalism. And second, that Nikki can pretty much do it on her own. That said, we do have someone with us today to talk with Nikki about News for the Rich, White, and Blue, who is himself very much an expert in these same threats to American democracy. And that's Matt Thompson of the New York Times. Matt is editor of the Times' new Headway Initiative, which does deep investigations into economics, health, the environment, and more. Matt has worked at the Fresno Bee, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the Atlantic, as well as at the Center for Public Integrity and the Poynter Institute. In her book, Nikki writes that journalism is what enables an active and engaged citizenry. So last, I welcome everyone who's joined us today, because as good and important as Nikki's book is, we can't win this great battle for democracy in the 21st century unless every citizen is active and engaged and every citizen is working to protect and rebuild American journalism. Finally, one little note, which is that this is being recorded for Book TV's on C-SPAN. We don't have a air date for that, but hopefully we'll let you know soon. Now let me turn it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to be here to discuss this book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue: How Place and Power Distorts American Journalism, with Nikki. So Nikki, I think it would probably be hard to be a journalist in the U.S. news industry today and not feel like your book describes our world to a certain extent. So we'll test the premise of your book a little bit, I'm sure, in this conversation, but I want to assume it at first. You say, our news media struggles at present to amplify the voices that most need to be heard in a democracy, those who lack institutional power, political representation, and meaningful redress to structural discrimination. And yet, I would say most journalists I know, and I know a lot of journalists, come into this field with this passion for uplifting the voices of everyday people, particularly those most at risk of discrimination or of oppression from power. So how is it that we come in with these noble ideals, and then end up reinforcing or amplifying structural inequities that course through the society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question, Matt, and thanks again for being here and chatting with me about this. But I think let's also acknowledge the fact that there really is a lot of tremendous journalism done by national news organizations who are shining a light on power and inequality, including stuff you've done too. So It's just one of the things I start to worry is actually that it becomes these huge national news organizations, of which there really aren't that many, right? Like the Times, the Journal, the Post, maybe CNN, right? That are doing these spotlights, right? And they are doing them well, but it's often extractive. Like, let me explain this poor person in Mississippi who has raw sewage flowing into her home, right? And so there is great journalism. There is journalism that is focused on these concerns, but it's being told about people rather than for them. And so I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is that you just get trapped into doing what journalism always does, right? There are certain kinds of stories that you cover. There are certain kinds of stories that are going to win awards. You end up reinforcing power because you end up talking to the powerful to get information for your story, right? I was just talking about this with my students. You talk to the powerful because they're sources that matter, that can verify things and stuff like that, right? So there's that side of just like the institutional routines of journalism. And then you kind of have to look within yourself too, and within ourselves to think about who gets to be a journalist today and who gets to be a journalist in these newsrooms that are telling these stories. And increasingly, they don't look like the rest of the United States. And this isn't like an anti-intellectual thing, obviously. It's more just like, do people's experiences that have led them to a newsroom give them the ability to either be conscious of their blind spots or to understand kind of like what the issues are before them that need to be told, right?
One of the questions that I wondered most as I was reading the book is what you think has changed the most. So you mentioned just now that these failures or weaknesses, at least, of journalism are long-standing. They are aspects in some cases of how journalism has typically engaged, at least here in the U.S., with a political power elite. What do you think are the biggest changes that have amplified and reinforced that dissonance between who's represented in newsrooms, who's represented in the news, and what the needs, concerns, and people are that populate our country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, there has always been a media elite. There has always been a power elite. The question now that I think is really kind of making this 10 times worse is the fact that we really are at a crisis point in journalism. We used to debate in the academy, like, whether the word crisis was apt to describe what was happening to journalism today. But no, major newspaper chains are actually literally going bankrupt. Hedge funds are taking over large, important news organizations and stripping them to the core. And so the economic fragility of the news industry is at an all-time uncertainty. And this doesn't just go for newspapers, it also goes for digital first publications. It goes for the disruption of internet TV and cable and all of this stuff. So the economic precarity that news organizations across the United States are facing, right, creates a different set of incentives for survival. And then for the people who choose to go into journalism, it's really hard to convince people who don't have a safety net that they should bank on this as a career if they want to help make the world a better place. I mean, it's just, there are more stable jobs, right, that still help people.
Yeah.
And so I think that ends up being a really, really serious problem where people are scared to take the risk to become a journalist because it's a risk now, right?
Yeah, and a risk for all sorts of reasons, economic, political, and other. I kind of wanted to talk in terms of the three dimensions of place that you mention in your book. You talk about place as both a geographic and material setting for news, as you put it. Place as being something that's lived, where we go to the grocery store, we travel on highways, and place as having cultural, economic, and symbolic power. And so I kind of wanted to talk all three of those. I think contribute to the divides that you chronicle in the book. And or I should say to the forces that you chronicle to the book. So I kind of wanted to ask about the ways in which all three of them separately contribute to the problem and the ways in which they reinforce each other. So starting with the geographic one, you talk a lot about where newsrooms are and aren't. And one of the things that's always struck me and that I most wanted to ask you about is that newsrooms in a lot of cities, the sort of classic ideal of where the newsroom is situated in a city is a beacon, a big building in downtown with security guards at all the entrances, and where it's both a symbol that this place has a powerful institution that is holding the powerful accountable, that's down the road from City Hall, but also potentially a kind of alienating monolith where the news is made behind closed doors in walls somewhere. And is there a possibility that as those newsrooms, as that real estate has gotten challenging for these corporations, for media companies to uphold, that it actually sends them deeper into their communities and makes journalism in the process of making it more accessible?
I mean, I love the positive gloss, and I'd be curious what you see, because what you think too, because COVID has been a really significant disruptor in the fact that journalists are now working from home and getting out into communities is potentially like life-threatening, right? You know, depending on who you are and where you're going, right? And it's not war-torn things, it's a virus, right? So that's a real limit on the mobility of journalists to actually do reporting. But I mean, I think that, look, if you think about the New York Times, it's positioned in a place where I don't know how many thousands, is it millions of people that go through the Port Authority and Times Square in a single day and see this gigantic building that's like beautiful and very clearly like a skyscraper to the New York Times. You know, I think Chicago is like the ultimate example of all of this, because the Chicago Tribune, it's like having a Gothic cathedral in the middle of Michigan, you know, in the middle of Michigan Avenue. And, you know, my students don't realize that that's now a historical landmark. So you can go in and you can see the lobby. It's actually, and but it's the Chicago Tribune, but they're not there anymore. It's gonna be somebody's condos, right? But I think that loss of a symbol and that loss of, you know, being a monolith really, I think, undermines to some degree the authority of some of these news organizations in places. And part of it is that people see the news building disappear and they think there isn't any news or any newspaper anymore. And that, I think, like out of sight, out of mind. This is a big concern when I talk to journalists in Miami, because Miami Herald was in the center of downtown. They literally knocked it down with like a wrecking ball, and it is not there anymore, right? And in a place where out of sight, out of mind is a real thing, I think that that's really, you know, deeply problematic. Does it send journalists into their communities more? I mean, I think you would hope so, right? Because you don't actually want a lot of journalists in the newsroom, right? You want journalists, like, especially reporters, you want them like out and about in the community. So we would hope so, but my worry is we get even more enclaved, right? Like you become like, since you don't have to go downtown to go to the newsroom, you're not going to encounter the homeless person every day on the street before you hop on to the metro, or the one you usually see riding the city bus. And so like those encounters with people outside of your daily routine, I think really are, I mean, I really worry about that. You need to be around people who aren't like you and put in situations that you're not used to being in and are not always comfortable in to do good journalism. So, you know, I'd be curious, because you joined the Times, right, at a time when, you know, you're not even in the building, you're coming to us from San Francisco, right? You know, I kind of flip the question back on you too, Matt.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I see, and there's, I'll ask you about this in a second, like there's this ambivalence that courses through your book. And I feel ambivalent about this too. Like on the one hand, um, there are all of these cities. I mean, Minneapolis, when it's interesting. When I worked at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Star Tribune building was very prominently downtown with the Star Tribune carved in stone into the top of the building. If you were going to a Vikings game, you were going to see the Star Tribune as this big sort of institution anchoring downtown. And now it's in a beautiful skyscraper, still downtown. The name of the newspaper is not quite so prominent, and the former site of the Star Tribune building is occupied by the Viking Stadium, by an expanded Viking Stadium. And so I feel ambivalent about it. On the one hand, the Star Tribune staff has been reasonably robust next to some of the other. It has come back after one of the most troubling periods, I will say, that any metropolitan newspaper has gone through. Just that's a story for another day. But there's a vibe that the paper is active in its community, healthy relative to where it was, still fighting for its existence every day. But I don't know, when Minneapolis was experiencing its peak waves of protest in 2020, last year, I don't know if the journalists that were downtown, I don't know how many of them felt personally the pressures and tensions that had been cooking in that city, down by Powderhorn Park, which is a distance away from downtown. I don't know how much the residents who fought for and identified with the lake in Minneapolis being changed from being named after John C. Calhoun to being named back to its original indigenous name, Lake Damacoska. I don't know where the residents who felt represented by that change, if they also felt represented by the Star Tribune, saw journalists in their neighborhood regularly, saw the authority that the institution had as being an authoritative to them as well. I can't tell you those things, despite having lived and been a journalist in Minnesota. So I don't know. I'm ambivalent, and it feels like that ambivalence, that same flavor of ambivalence, really runs through your book. Like you were saying two things at once: that journalism is critical and does and can do a significant amount to shore up, reinforce, and make healthy a democracy. And on the other hand, that it also reinforces patterns and inequities that are destructive to democracy. So is that ambivalence? Do you feel that?
I mean, like, the answer for every academic is it's complicated, right? And that's my way of dealing with the complication, is that, like, I think that the conversation, and I'm thankful for open markets for not taking a sort of like baked in nostalgia sort of tack about American journalism, is you can't really get to the heart of what's happening in American journalism around the crisis of trust, around the economic crisis, around a crisis of arguably having a lack of representation in the newsroom. You can't talk about that stuff when you're waxing eloquent about public service journalism and serving the community and what happens when the watchdogs aren't there. Like, you have to be real about the ways in which news organizations and journalists are part of the power structure, right? They're not always perfect. They've, perpetuated legacies of racism and segregation, if not in actuality de facto, right? And so, I mean, you can't just try to put a band-aid on the problems in journalism by pretending all of that doesn't exist. And I think that that's like kind of my big objection, is that if you want to talk about changing journalism and changing journalism for the better, this idea of preserving institutions that have not always done what they've promised and often fallen very short of the goal, that's one goal. But if you're curious, if you want to save journalism, you have to think about what is the function of journalism, not the institution of a newspaper, right? And I think that that's kind of what I'm getting at. That journalism is important and it matters, but as it is currently imagined, we cannot have an honest conversation about what it does for society and democracy unless we acknowledge that it is also flawed, right? As we currently imagine it. So I think that's it.
In the process of researching, of putting together the research, and I would say reporting that led to this book, what gave you the most hope? What was there anything that you saw that you were like, that looks like a post newspaper development that really lights me up?
I think that there's a real difficulty because I recognize, as somebody who has long studied elite media and elite news media, that you need the news organizations that are powerful institutional voices. And some of the most exciting experiments in journalism who are serving people who are underserved for news. And I think about things like Outlier. I think about some of the work going on in Philadelphia. I think about City Bureau in Chicago. Some of the most exciting experiments in journalism are very sort of community centered, about communities, for communities, and that's awesome. But I wonder about their ability to really speak back to power, because there are entire city governments that have no idea that they exist, right? And then I think about more rural areas where I am now. And I take a lot of hope in the fact that there are people who don't consider themselves journalists that are somehow also putting out election guides on a mom blog, right? We've got this Shambana Moms blog and this group Smile Politely that puts out a lot of restaurant views, but also is protesting east of mugshots in our newspaper. And so, I think that there's a lot of hope, but I just wonder how much power people on the periphery, even if they are working in journalism, have to get the attention of very powerful people. And that's what I worry about, is like, there are all these awesome, authentic ways of doing journalism that people are thinking about. And I encourage my students to see this too, right? And I encourage anybody interested in journalism to see this. But how do we make sure that if City Bureau in Chicago uncovers the next Watergate, that somebody actually cares? And that's what I worry about,
Yeah. I think that tension between the access and reach to power and the authenticity, reach, and representation of the journalism, that I have felt like every day, I would say, of my career. Possibly nowhere more than in DC, where that access in its most brutal and bad incarnations is like a game. It's like, what are people in power, what are people with proximity to power willing to give up for what sort of representation in coverage? I guess, are there alternatives to are there other ways of building power that reaches powerful people than having to go to DC and go to fancy dinners, or be physically, geographically removed from the people whose voices you're representing or purporting to represent in your coverage?
Yeah, I think that delicate dance of access and power, you need to be close to it to understand it, right? I think the advantage that you and I have is that we've been in that world and we've left it, right? But we understand it. We're not scared by it. To understand how to move through a room in Washington is a considerably important skill, and to be comfortable with people who are in charge of governing is a really important thing. The soul sucking around doing things that you don't necessarily believe in, but you're doing it because it gives you power is something that you see up close. But the problem is like, you get sucked into that world and you think of what's happening in your immediate circumstance as the most important. And anybody who's been in DC for a long time knows that you can literally make a joke about something that was on CNN about an hour ago, and everybody in the room will get it. And that's a very weird DC thing. And the story of the day in DC is so often so far from the story of the day outside DC, right? If the story of the day in DC is, the debt ceiling, the story of the day in Minneapolis is what's happening with the Vikings, right? And so that disconnect is really, really problematic. One of the things that I think is really interesting is when people have flipped this. And so there are a number of journalists who are working for very insular DC publications like Politico, arguably Vox, ProPublica, some of these like real sort of standard bearers who have chosen not to live in these big cities. And I think that that's a really like, how do you cover national news not from DC? Well, of course you can do that. You don't have to necessarily be in DC to cover national news. And I think that some journalists are really conscious of that. And I think that we'll start to see, as journalists get more embedded in like different communities, ways that they can leverage the institutions they're a part of to still be better connected to non-DC and New York.
Yeah, this we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A, and so I will in a moment start DJing those questions into our conversation. It's interesting, when I was at Reveal, also known as the Center for Investigative Reporting, just before coming to the Times, I look at Reveal's Amazon investigation led by Will Evans, reporter at Reveal. And I think of it as an example of building power from a lot of different voices. Amazon's been investigated by a lot of journalists, and its labor practices in particular have come under a lot of scrutiny by the press. But it's been pretty hard for those stories, I would say, to sort of break through. But I would say that the Reveal's investigation really did, in part because that reporting was very much focused on finding employees working at Amazon warehouses across the country and equipping them with the know-how to get these forms documenting injuries in their warehouses, in their organizations. And so we had people sending us these forms. Those forms could only be requested by workers. And so we had people from all over the country sending Reveal, here's what we found, here are injuries. And that enabled us to put together this picture that Amazon could not deny. And I would say it felt like an alternative form of power. We would not have gotten that data from Amazon, although ultimately we compelled them through the courts to give us that data, to release that data. But that feels like an alternative to building power. And I'm curious, what are the possibilities that you see for a national organization, Reveal's scope is national, for example, to work with organizations like Reveal did, like the Indianapolis Star, the Seattle Times, the Denver Post, to craft power in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you, because you're really rethinking about how do we do investigative journalism from the bottom up, where the people who we're covering also become people who are part of creating the story themselves. And I think that when journalists start to leverage those connections in communities, right, that is bottom up power, challenging, using journalism, using big institutions as the vehicle for redirecting it upwards. And I think that, like, how can we continue to take the strategy that you all used for Amazon into other venues, right, with other corporations? I think corporations are the ones that actually, the crisis in journalism hurts more in terms of good reporting, because you can still request government documents, but if Amazon or Google don't want to give you their spending on a nuanced level, you're never going to get it. You're going to need to work with people on the inside. And so I think it may actually be, honestly, rethinking how we engage sources such that, it's not just as color or conversation or a starting point for the journalist to go off and do their own investigation, but actually part of uncovering stuff themselves, right? That goes beyond engaged journalism where people are like, hey, journalists, I was always curious about why there wasn't a statue of Ida B. Wells in Chicago. Oh, wow, now there is, right? Like that's one form, but you're talking about taking it to the nth degree, right? But the ability of large national news organizations then to bring together sort of smaller, more regional news organizations, I think that that's a way of amplifying, absolutely. But I worry a lot about like the internal talent shifts, right? Because you see, like, whenever one of these investigative reporting centers are founded, it's like the same old people who are actually at the best paper in that region or the best, rarely, but sometimes the best television station in that. And so it's like a reshuffling of talent. I don't know if it's a scaling as much as it is like a shuffling. So I prefer the prior approach of getting the people to do the work of challenging power and using the talent and organizing power of journalism to do that.
Yeah.
Most journalists would freak out, right, by this idea. This is like the kind of thing that sends shivers through like old school journalists to imagine sources having this kind of power to help create a story.
But you mentioned places like City Bureau in Chicago and its Documenters Project, where they're doing that, where they're sort of training ordinary people to do the base level work that goes into a functioning City Hall report, of going to the meetings and figuring out what questions to ask and asking them. I'm going to pull in, so I want to talk about the culture of the press for a second. You mentioned place is also cultural and symbolic, and so I'm going to pull in this question from Nilesh Rathi. And Nilesh, apologies if I mispronounced your name. Would you say, Nilesh asks, that the media heroification and later vilification of big city, politically centrist figures is an example of a bias in class, religion, color, and ideology? And Nilesh mentions Rudy Giuliani after 9/11, Andrew Cuomo in 2020, and there are probably any number of examples just from New York, if we want to. Anthony Weiner.
I mean, I think that it's absolutely right. The fact that anybody in Peoria can tell you who the mayor of New York City is like really tells you something about the way in which the media inflates certain places and very provincial things. Right? I know way too much about the New York mayoral race for somebody living in central Illinois. But I mean, I think that there are these relationships that develop over time, and I think that Giuliani became a mayor, Cuomo became a governor, but oh my gosh, particularly for Governor Cuomo, the relationships that his family has had with the news media in New York goes back an entire generation, right? I remember when his dad was a senator, I was a kid, right? And so I think that what it tends to reflect is this embedded power relationship that is very long lasting and very much a part of how journalism works and how you get these stories. And there are only certain kinds of people that are being brought into those rooms. And, for Cuomo, we can make some bad jokes about people being brought into rooms, but we will not do that. And I think that, right, I think that bias that you're talking about in terms of class and region and color and ideology, I think that you're spot on. I mean, that's really my big central critique here is that, how we cover the powerful reflects to some idea, very much so, what the media elite understands to be power and why that is important. And the media elite itself, like journalists are powerful, especially at the largest national news organization.
Yeah. One of the One question comes from Dan Frumkin. He asks whether we could discuss the effect of subscription firewalls on access and representation problems. And I guess to even add on, layer onto that question, how do we address the dissonance between who has access to consume the news and who is represented in quotes and news reports and elsewhere throughout the press?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing more maddening than the fact that certain people get better information than others because they're deemed as likely to pay and they are willing to pay. I mean, if journalism, I understand that journalism has to be paid for. I do, right? And there has to be some way to do it. But what happens is this ends up distorting sort of the conception among the people making the decisions about what becomes news, about who the audience is. The audience becomes subscribers, right? They are, Jack Schaefer referred to it as subscriber bait and subscription bait. And I think that's what's happening now. We have subscription bait, not clickbait, right? And that's the strategy. That's the only way going forward, but it really distorts even more so than it was before the image of who the news is for and being targeted to. And so increasingly when people are cut off from information, particularly at the local level, it becomes even easier to treat the people who are the subjects of stories as subjects, right? Rather than as people who matter, who we're going to engage with and, stories told about rather than stories for, because it's not for those people, right? If we're talking about, chronicling the effects of poverty in a city or something like that. And, yes, it's important for people who are in elite decision-making positions to have great information, but the downstream effects of people being kept from having really important information to run their daily lives, that's really, really problematic. You have to pay to know something about like what's happening with your sewer, because sometimes the newspapers in a city are the only place you're going to get that information. And now you have no idea why your school bus driver isn't showing up.
That's all right. I mean, I think the one of the challenges I would say for us in the business is that we like, what do you do, I guess? And I would point this question to you. So I went to Harvard, I did the same nomadic journalism thing that a lot of journalists do, where I've reported or edited in Fresno, St. Pete, Columbia, Missouri, Minneapolis, DC, and the incentives of the profession kind of point us in that direction of perhaps getting more immersed in a culture of the press than in a particular place, where we're deeply rooted and connected, not just on a city level, but on a neighborhood level to the concerns of a public. But having identified that prescription, what's the work in journalists to do? How do we overcome or mitigate or even approach entirely different pathways to journalism, to see parts of the world that our background, training, education, class privilege, etc., might obscure us to?
No, I mean, I think like there is this larger culture of what it means to be a successful journalist. And I think that challenging what success means is part of it, like particularly like talking and speaking with young journalists. Is it really always like, is being in DC, right? Or, if you're a sports reporter is working for ESPN, like, is that really the end goal? Or is there a different end goal that's equally valuable, important, and arguably more true to what we started this conversation with, which is like a desire to change things and tell stories of people that sort of right injustices, right? So I think that that's like one side of it. I think that in terms of like, you kind of put the economic crisis and kind of the crisis and representation inside journalism together, and they should be taken together. But I think the most important part of all of this is making the people who are working in newsrooms look more like the communities they cover. And there's no excuse. And I looked at these stats yesterday. 9% of Detroit is black, or sorry, is white, right? And when you look at the number of journalists who are white in the Detroit Free Press, it's something like 80%. And you can't tell me that there aren't ways to do better. How, like, do better, right? And how are we failing as people who care about this stuff to not make it possible for people to be empowered to become journalists, to work in these spaces, and to leverage that institutional power to do bottom up, top directed journalism? And so, yeah, I don't know, Matt. So we can, the stuff that you've been doing with ONA and NABJ and all of these news associations, I've started to see colleges sponsor internships. Like, I think Duke is sponsoring some internships with the LA Times. It's Duke, but that's a good thing. I think, something we've talked about before is rethinking federal work study so that people don't have to choose between covering, working for their student newspaper and taking, a job swiping gym cards, right? Or even taking a third job just so they can afford to work at a student newspaper. Just kind of like easing some of the federal loan forgiveness. This is something journalists are not included as part of the federal loan forgiveness. I think nonprofit journalists could definitely be swept in without a lot. I don't know. Whenever you bring up journalism in Congress, it's a big conflagration, right? But yeah, we can do better. We need to do better. And part of doing better is having these conversations that we're having today and not shutting up about it.
Yeah. I would say it's also, it can be easy, especially if you just train the lens on something like race and ethnicity in thinking about diversity, as opposed to considering a multidimensional, including class in your analysis and income and wealth privilege. Too, it can be pretty easy to create access for, and to pat yourself on the back, I would say, for creating access to folks who are actually pretty well represented in newsrooms. And I am not, I'm curious how we define and speak explicitly. I think this is one of the challenges. How do we talk in newsrooms about where our deficits are? Because I don't hear that I hear both a lot of fervor for diversity, for diversifying our newsrooms, for broader representation and greater reach to communities who are left out of the journalism, but the explicit appeals, or trying to figure out how to make explicit who we are missing, whose voices we are going without, I think is a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're the kind of person who has, and I know you've started these conversations very explicitly, right? Because you've been empowered as a person of color in some of the most elite newsrooms in the country. And we need more people like you, right, to be in those positions, and not just because they have an Ivy League degree and happen to have the cultural class to make it happen, And so I think it's like there's talking around diversity and there's putting data to bear. And I think sometimes that when you have that data, it makes it super, super powerful, and it can't be ignored. So I think that's why some of the stuff around the Ask Me survey is so important. Some of the work that the students who are part of the Asian American Journalists Association, every summer they come up with some crazy piece that's like, look at the lack of representation. And it's like really bounded in like internship classes, right? And I think the New Yorker, right, when the archives editor of the New Yorker literally went through 40,000 articles looking at like the number of Black editors of any one piece and the number of book reviews written by women, like something like 32%. Like, you need the data to be able to draw the stark picture for people who are, journalists are empiricists, right? The data needs to be the guide and the benchmark, I think. And when you just talk vaguely about diversity and we need to improve, right? What have you done lately? And really being deliberate at looking at this. I think we've had these conversations on like just quoting women, right? There's, who was it? Is it, I know, I forget, somebody at the Atlantic was doing that like survey every year of like,
Oh, Ed Young.
was it Ed Young? Yeah. So, am I quoting enough women, right? A self-assessment. That needs to be part and parcel of the practice of doing news work,
Yeah. I'm going to pull in a related question from Avery Holton, who said, when it comes to the bottom-upness of investigative reporting and community connection reporting, how do we connect with the unconnected, such as Indigenous people without Wi-Fi and those who are perhaps less connected, but connected nonetheless in community spaces such as Nextdoor, which may not be great reporting platforms, but are insightful in the micro community issues. So how do we connect with the unconnected, and what is journalism's relationship, I guess, to platforms like Nextdoor, and how can we use them better?
So currently obsessed with the role of platforms as serving as the critical infrastructure for communities and the problems with that. But it's hard to ignore that in places like Illinois and some of these more rural counties, news as it is traditionally understood doesn't move fast enough to capture changing community dynamics. And you really see this with COVID. A newspaper that publishes once a week can't keep up, right? So Facebook and it's not Nextdoor out here. There's just not like in my college town, yes, but that's not in like the rural counties. There's no Nextdoor. Because right, think about it, Nextdoor is like block by block, right? Like there's
Right.
density for that. But to so that's like, I think part one, really thinking about the role of these platforms and whether we want these platforms to be the critical communication infrastructure. And that's actually the project I'm working on for the Center for Journalism and Liberty with open markets. Like, oh my gosh, what does it mean that these for-profit platforms are serving as a lifeblood for information for those people who are not maybe necessarily connected to traditional forms of news? But I think that there's a big assumption being made between the disconnected and the journalist as we're imagining it. And Sue Robinson, a scholar at Wisconsin, she talks about the ways in which journalists fail to really engage with the leaders and narratives that are happening. So there are always, like, in the unconnected people, there's somebody more connected, right?
Yeah.
And that more connected person needs to be the person that a journalist seeks out to get to those disconnected, unconnected people. And so the gulf is not as binary as it may seem. And I would also be wary of over presuming disconnection, because the disconnection may come from being connected and being pissed off at what is being seen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're not seeing ourselves represented, So I think it's a really great question and one we need to think more about.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of being an intern doing coverage in Orlando, where the local newspaper was referred to as the Orlando Slantinel. And it was just such a reminder of the fact that you can have a press in a place, but if the press, the precepts of the press and the values of it in that place are at odds with the culture of that place, which they were in Orlando. I mean, there were a lot of questions about, from an evangelical Christian community that I was embedded in Orlando, there were a lot of questions about, like, how should we treat the press? Like, they're secular, they don't quite share our religious values. And I've always sort of wondered what to do with that. There's an interesting question here from Adam Stoltman, who asks about visual journalism versus traditional written journalism. Adam Stoltman says, photojournalists are often by necessity more embedded in the communities they report on, and often of necessity embedded longer. Do you think that we undertend the role that visual platforms can play, photojournalism can play in representing a community in a different way from, like, either the boilerplate 600-word incremental news story or the long, beautiful magazine length narrative journalism?
Right. I mean,
study?
some of the most beautiful long magazine length journalism is photo essays, right? I mean,
Yeah.
days are really pretty incredible, right? And telling things that text-based journalism or even documentary style or broadcast journalism can do. I mean, I think that it's nice that Adam sees photojournalists as being deeply embedded in communities, because I'm not sure that's always the case. I think it really depends on the journalist. There's a story in the LA Times Reckoning, which is journalists at the LA Times kind of writing about their experiences, but also the past of the LA Times, where a photojournalist refused to enter Watts because he was scared, right? And so I think it really, really depends, right? And it's a really great question we need to think more about. I think we're in the golden age of photojournalism and illustration generally. And I think we really, like, every time I go online, I'm just astounded by like some beautiful drawing, right? And those are conveying really important visual information. But some of the choices compound existing stories. So the New York Times did this big story on education in rural America, and all the photos are in black and white. Oh, stark! It's all bad there, right? And it's just like, that's a choice too.
Absolutely, yeah. And meanwhile, I mean, I would say like one of the pleasures of a platform like TikTok is getting a window into totally different experience somewhere around the world, and getting a bunch of different windows next to one another. And I don't know that we've figured out what to do with that power to link a bunch of different perspectives, and also to go beyond what we can see just on the platforms and figure out who's not here and how do we create a window into their experience too. We had a couple questions I wanted to sort of lightning round in here. One from Virginia Aguchi, who asks if we can speak to the issue of salaries in journalism and how that contributes to journalists seeking work for larger orgs or in bigger cities.
I mean, I think, you followed that track, right? And I've left DC for, it's not just journalism, right? It's the academy, right? To make money work as a journalist who doesn't have a safety net is really hard, right? Especially starting out, and especially in some of these big cities. So kind of the lower you are on the food chain, the more precarious it is. And then if you can stick it out long enough, maybe you can actually make a decent amount of money one day, maybe. But I do think that, people trying to work at bigger organizations because they have a healthcare plan and maybe pay them a little bit more. Yeah, absolutely. That distorts who works and where they work and where they choose to work and where they choose to live. And so, it's something we need to think about. What role might unionization play? What role might transparency play, right? Like journalists hold other news organizations, other institutions to be accountable for their salaries. But when the Washington Post went through and looked at salaries doing kind of like, please volunteer your information, all the expected disparities that you saw, would expect were present. Right? Self-audits are super important, because you might find out that the person next to you is making 10 grand more with the same profile, and maybe it's because they're a dude, right?
Right. I'm going to throw in one more from Tyson Evans, who asks about the potential impact of the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, or about the possibility of government intervention more broadly. What do you think? I mean, I guess I will just volunteer.
Yeah,
one of the interesting I've always had this kind of funny little counterpoint to narratives of decline in local newspapers, and the one print newspaper that I subscribe to is the Plainview News, which comes from my partner's hometown of Plainview, Minnesota, but still somehow gets delivered to us in California. We subscribe to it. I don't know how it gets delivered to us, but one of the things that keeps the Plainview News, I think, alive is one of those implicit government subsidies, the public notices that appears in the paper every week. So what do you think about the possibility that journalism could, or that public government intervention could step in to craft a different
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the goals with open markets is to understand how to make news organizations more competitive within the marketplace so they can actually survive independently. Sometimes the way through is by using existing legislation and existing sort of powers of the government and the executive branch to tear down some of those barriers. And I think that for me, you know, some of the ways of leveling all of that is breaking down monopolies, whether that be the news chains that actually are being run by hedge funds and making terrible choices for local news, but also obviously Facebook and Google and Amazon, right? I think that's the first step for me, quite frankly. After 4 years of Donald Trump, I am extraordinarily soured on the idea of active expansions of government subsidies for the news media, but I'm glad that there are still believers out there.
What did you come over the course of researching and reporting this book to think of as maybe the healthiest ways of sustaining and supporting journalism? And this we are at 3 minutes till the top of the hour, and so this may be your last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things I tried to double down on is there isn't a one size fits all solution. And particularly when it comes to local news, like that is tied to geographically specific community, it may be that important news producers aren't journalists at all, right? They might be the school system, it might be something else. So really tapping into in each place, what does it look like to provide the kind of news people need to get with their daily lives? And what is it that professional journalists offer that cannot be done by another news organization? So I've been like trying to come up with this measure of news resilience to understand the ability of any one community to withstand the loss of local media. I think that's one way. And I'm still really convinced that we can shift the flow of money in politics to shore up some partisan Democrat alternatives to some of the right-wing local press that we're seeing. Nobody wants to take me up on that, but can we just take some campaign donations and like funnel them to local media? Because Republicans are already doing that in kind.
Well, there's this whole sort of other line of coverage, and by the way, I should mention an anonymous attendee in the Q&A points out public notices are not a subsidy, and that's absolutely right. I shouldn't refer to them as such, even though they are in some cases one of the big income streams that's like that is propping up or making it possible for some printed papers to exist. But there's this whole other line of questions that just opens up, and I wish that we could keep talking longer because the book is fascinating. It is filled with really interesting both case studies and ideas for where we've come from and where we're headed, and we could go on for hours talking about it. So now I will encourage folks to check it out. News for the Rich, White, and Blue, How Place and Power Distort American Journalism is on sale at a bookstore near you, or at least online. Nikki, not Amazon. Nikki, thank you so much for this exchange and for the book.
Thank you so much for chatting with me about it, and thanks to Open Markets. So take care, everyone.